In 1872, a British archaeologist named George Smith made a discovery that would shake him to his core. Working late into the night at the British Museum, surrounded by thousands of clay tablets recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, Smith was translating a series of Sumerian texts that had been gathering dust for decades. What he read made him stand up so abruptly that his chair fell backward. His hands trembled as he held the tablet. According to colleagues who were there, Smith did something completely out of character for a reserved Victorian scholar. He started tearing off his clothes in excitement and ran around the room shouting that he had discovered something that would change everything we thought we knew about human history. But here's the thing. The tablet that caused this reaction, it wasn't the flood story that Smith became famous for. That came later. No. Witnesses reported that Smith had been working on a different set of tablets that night. Tablets that described something far more disturbing. Tablets that were quietly removed from public display shortly after. Tablets that described Earth not as humanity's home, but as a prison planet. And us? We weren't the pinnacle of creation. We were the inmates, or more accurately, we were the labor force. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another conspiracy theory, I need you to understand something. The Sumerians weren't primitive people making up fairy tales around a campfire. They invented writing. They created the wheel. They had advanced mathematics, astronomy, and legal systems. They accurately described our solar system thousands of years before we had telescopes. They knew about planets we didn't discover until the 1900s. And their creation story? It's not a simple myth about a god molding clay. It's a detailed account that reads less like religion and more like a scientific report. A report about genetic engineering, about mining operations, about rebellion and the creation of a slave species to replace workers who refused to continue. The tablets describe beings called the Anunnaki. The name literally translates to those who from heaven to earth came. Not gods, in the supernatural sense. Physical beings. Beings who ate, drank, got tired, fought wars, had children, and eventually died. Just like us. Except they lived for thousands of years. And they had technology we still can't fully explain. These tablets say the Anunnaki came here 450,000 years ago with a specific mission. To mine gold. Not for jewelry or currency, but because their own planet's atmosphere was failing, and gold particles could somehow repair it. They established mining operations in what is now southern Africa, and for thousands of years, their own workers, called the Igigi, did the brutal labor deep underground. But then something happened. After 40 years of backbreaking work in conditions that even these advanced beings found unbearable, the Igigi rebelled. They threw down their tools. They marched to the compound of Enlil, the commander of Earth operations. They surrounded his home and set their tools on fire. They weren't going back down into those mines. The tablets describe an emergency council being called. The Anunnaki leadership had a problem. The gold mining couldn't stop. Their home planet needed it. But they also couldn't force their own people back into slavery. So one of them, a scientist named Enki, proposed a solution that would change the course of history forever. He suggested creating a new worker, a primitive worker, by mixing the genetic material of the Anunnaki with the most advanced primate species already living on Earth. The tablets don't call this magic. They describe it in terms that sound disturbingly like modern genetic engineering, trial and error, failed experiments, creatures that couldn't survive or couldn't reproduce. And then finally, success. The creation of what they called the Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, us, Homo sapiens. And here's what should keep you up at night. According to these tablets, we weren't designed to be their equals. We were designed with specific limitations. Shorter lifespans so we couldn't accumulate too much knowledge or power. Just intelligent enough to follow complex instructions and operate mining equipment, but not intelligent enough to question or rebel. At least, that was the plan. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is just ancient mythology, stories that primitive people made up to explain the world around them. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1973, researchers discovered something strange in our DNA, something that shouldn't be there if we evolved naturally. We have 223 genes that appear nowhere else in the evolutionary tree, genes that scientists admit don't seem to have evolved gradually but appeared suddenly, fully formed, as if they were inserted. And then there's the chromosome 2 fusion. Every single primate species on Earth has 48 chromosomes, except us. We have 46. At some point in our recent evolutionary past, 2 chromosomes fused together. The question scientists can't agree on is whether this happened naturally or whether someone made it happen. My name is Mr. H, and on this channel, we dive deep into the mysteries that mainstream science and history would rather you didn't think too hard about. If you're the kind of person who asks uncomfortable questions, who isn't satisfied with easy answers, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what we're about to explore over the next 2 hours is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about who we are and why we're here. Trust me, you're going to want to stay for this entire journey. So let's get back to those tablets, the ones that disappeared from public view, the ones that describe Earth as a carefully controlled prison planet. Because if the Sumerians were right, if we really were genetically engineered to be a labor force, then we need to ask some very serious questions. Questions like, who was humanity built to serve? Are we still serving them? And if Earth is a prison, is there any way to break free? The story of how we even know about these tablets is almost as strange as what's written on them. In the mid-1800s, European archaeologists began excavating the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. What they found buried beneath thousands of years of sand and debris was astonishing. Entire libraries, massive collections of clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped writing that no one had seen in over 2,000 years. We're not talking about a few dozen tablets here. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of them. Some estimates suggest that over 500,000 tablets were recovered from sites like Nineveh, Babylon, Uruk, and Nippur. Now here's the first mystery. Of those 500,000 tablets, only a fraction have been fully translated and published. Many remain in museum basements and private collections, still covered in the dirt they were pulled from over a century ago. Why? The official explanation is lack of funding, lack of qualified translators, lack of time. But some researchers suggest there's another reason, that certain tablets contain information so disturbing, so contradictory to established historical and religious narratives, that there's been a quiet, unofficial policy to keep them away from public scrutiny. And some tablets? They've simply vanished, gone missing from museum inventories with no explanation. But let's focus on the ones we do have access to, the ones that have been translated, starting with the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Now, most scholars treat this as pure mythology, a story about gods fighting and creating the world from the corpse of a defeated goddess. But when you read it carefully, when you look past the poetic language, something else emerges. The text describes our solar system with remarkable accuracy. It lists planets in their correct order. It describes planetary characteristics that shouldn't have been visible to the naked eye. And it tells the story of a collision between a planet called Tiamat and another celestial body called Nibiru that resulted in the formation of Earth and the asteroid belt. Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial researcher who spent 50 years studying these tablets, pointed out something that mainstream scholars tried to dismiss, but couldn't fully explain. The Sumerians depicted the sun as being surrounded by 11 planets, plus the sun itself, 12 celestial bodies total. But we've only officially discovered 8 planets, 9 if you count Pluto. Where did the Sumerians get the idea of additional planets? How did they even know about planets like Uranus and Neptune that can't be seen without telescopes? The standard explanation is that they were just guessing, or that later translators are reading too much into vague descriptions. But that explanation starts to fall apart when you see Sumerian cylinder seals that clearly show the sun surrounded by multiple spherical bodies in what looks suspiciously like an orbital diagram. Then we have the Atrahasis text. This is where things get really uncomfortable. The Atrahasis is one of the oldest stories in human history, dating back at least 4,000 years, though it's clearly copied from even earlier sources. And it tells a story that reads less like mythology and more like a labor dispute report. The text describes a time before humans existed, when the Anunnaki gods had divided up the world. The senior gods lived in comfort while the junior gods, the Igigi, were assigned to do the actual work. Specifically, they were digging canals, dredging rivers, and most importantly, mining in the Abzu, which scholars agree refers to underground mining operations in southern Africa. The text is very specific about the timeline. It says, the Igigi labored for 40 years. 40 years of brutal, exhausting work. And then, they'd had enough. The tablets describe their rebellion in vivid detail. They burned their tools. They marched at night to the house of Enlil, the chief administrator of Earth. They surrounded his dwelling and demanded an end to their suffering. The text quotes them saying, the work was heavy, the distress too much. Every day the earth resounded with our complaints and groaning. Now, think about this for a moment. Why would ancient people create a creation myth where the gods are depicted as exhausted workers complaining about their jobs. That's not how mythology typically works. Gods in myths are usually all-powerful, effortless creators. But these tablets describe something very different. They describe beings who got tired, who struggled with difficult work, who rebelled against poor working conditions. It reads like a historical account, not a religious allegory. So what happened next? This is where the genetic engineering comes in. According to the Atrahasis, Enlil wanted to simply punish the rebels and force them back to work. But Enki, who's consistently portrayed as the more compassionate and scientifically minded of the leaders, suggested an alternative. The tablets quote him proposing, "While the birth goddess is present, let her create a primitive worker. Let him bear the yoke. Let him carry the toil of the gods." The birth goddess he's referring to is Ninhursag, also called Ninmah, who's described throughout Sumerian texts as having expertise in what we would now call genetics or biology. But here's what makes this so eerie. The tablets don't describe a simple magical creation. They describe a process, a scientific process with multiple failed attempts. The Atrahasis and other texts describe Enki and Ninhursag conducting experiments, creating beings that were malformed, that couldn't reproduce, that died quickly. One passage describes creatures that were neither male nor female. Another describes beings that could not hold back their urine. These sound like the results of genetic experiments gone wrong, trial and error. And after multiple failures, they finally succeeded in creating a being that could survive, reproduce, and perform the required labor. The text describes them taking the essence of a young Anunnaki male and mixing it with the clay or earth of the primitive beings already on the planet. Now, scholars insist that clay is just a metaphor, but what if it's not? What if clay was the best word they had for biological material? For DNA? The tablets describe this mixture being placed in the wombs of Anunnaki females, who carried the first hybrid humans to term, 14 birth goddesses, 7 creating males, and 7 creating females. And from these 14 original humans, the entire slave workforce was bred. There's a tablet fragment that describes Enki speaking after the successful creation. He says, "I have removed your heavy work. I have imposed your toil on man." Think about the implications of that statement. The removal of work from the Anunnaki and the imposition of that same work on humanity. We were created, according to this, not as a beloved creation, not as the pinnacle of divine achievement, but as a replacement labor force, as biological machines designed to do work that someone else no longer wanted to do. And what work was that? Mining gold. The tablets repeatedly emphasize gold. The Anunnaki needed gold. They were desperate for it. But why? The texts claim it was to repair the atmosphere of their home planet, Nibiru. Now, this seemed absurd when Sitchin first proposed it in the 1970s. But here's something interesting. NASA and other space agencies currently use gold in spacecraft and satellites, specifically because of its unique properties. Gold is an excellent radiation shield. It's used to protect delicate instruments from cosmic radiation. It's used in the visors of astronaut helmets. Modern scientists are even exploring the possibility of using gold nanoparticles to reflect radiation and potentially modify atmospheric properties. So maybe the idea of using gold to repair a damaged atmosphere isn't as crazy as it first sounds. But back to the tablets. There's another set of texts that describe what happened after humans were created. At first, we were kept in a specific location, an area the Sumerians called the Edin, which some researchers believe is the origin of the word Eden. We were given specific tasks. We worked the fields, tended the gardens, and yes, worked in the mines. The tablets describe humans as being initially quite primitive, working naked, eating grass like animals. But then something changed. Several texts describe Enki taking pity on humans and giving us additional gifts: knowledge, agriculture, civilization. This act apparently angered Enlil, who believed humans should be kept ignorant and under control. This conflict between Enki and Enlil appears repeatedly throughout Sumerian literature. Enki is portrayed as humanity's benefactor, the one who repeatedly saves us and gives us knowledge. Enlil is portrayed as harsh, viewing humans as a noisy nuisance that should be kept in line or eliminated entirely. There's a text describing Enlil's reaction to humans becoming too numerous and too noisy. He says, "The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep." His solution? To send plagues, droughts, and ultimately a great flood to reduce the human population. The The flood story appears in multiple Sumerian and Babylonian texts, including the famous Epic of Gilgamesh. But in these older versions, the flood isn't sent by a loving God who's disappointed in humanity's sins. It's sent by Enlil specifically to wipe out the human workforce that's become too numerous and too independent. And Enki, acting against the decision of the council, secretly warns a human named Utnapishtim, or in other versions Zeusudra, telling him to build a boat and save himself, his family, and the genetic material of Earth's animals. After the flood, when Enlil discovers that humans survived, he's furious, but eventually he accepts it, and humanity is allowed to continue existing and serving. Now, here's a question that should bother you. Why would ancient people create a creation story where humanity is viewed as an annoying mistake that the gods tried to eliminate? Where we're depicted not as beloved children, but as noisy servants? This doesn't fit the pattern of mythology as wish fulfillment, or as a way to make humans feel special. If anything, it's the opposite. It's deeply unflattering. Unless, of course, it's not mythology at all. Unless it's a historical record of actual events, passed down and eventually written on clay tablets to preserve the truth of our origins. The tablets contain one more disturbing detail. They describe the Anunnaki as living for enormous spans of time. Their years are described differently than human years, with some passages suggesting that one Anunnaki year might equal thousands of Earth years. But even accounting for that, these beings lived for incredibly long periods. Enki, Enlil, and Anu are described as being present on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. Meanwhile, humans age and die within decades. Why the difference? According to some of the texts, it's because we were specifically designed with shortened lifespans. There's even a story about one human king, a man named Adapa, who was brought before Anu. Enki warns Adapa not to eat or drink anything offered to him in heaven, telling him it will be the food of death. But some scholars believe Enki was actually lying to protect the secret, that what Anu offered was actually the food of immortality, and Enki didn't want humans to gain that gift. We were made to serve. We were made to die young. We were made to be controlled. At least, that's what these ancient tablets tell us. And they're not vague about it. They're disturbingly specific. The question is, do we believe them? And if we do, what does that mean for us today, thousands of years later? Before we go deeper, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. Are you watching this at 3 a.m. because you can't sleep, going down rabbit holes like I do? Or maybe you're on your lunch break, sneaking in some forbidden knowledge between meetings. I love knowing there are people all over the world, in different time zones, all asking the same uncomfortable questions at the same moment. There's something powerful about that collective awakening, even if we're scattered across the planet. Now, let's talk about who these beings actually were. Because the more you dig into the Sumerian texts, the stranger the picture becomes. The Anunnaki weren't abstract, all-knowing deities floating in clouds. They had addresses, they had job titles, they had complicated family trees with inheritance disputes, property claims, and bitter rivalries that sometimes erupted into full-scale wars. The tablets catalogue their lives with the kind of bureaucratic detail you'd expect from government records, not religious texts. Take Anu, for example. He's described as the king who ruled from Nibiru, the home planet. But he didn't spend much time on Earth. He visited occasionally, and when he did, it was treated like a major state visit, with elaborate preparations and ceremonies. The tablets describe specific landing sites being prepared for his arrival, certain cities being designated as spaceports, and particular mountains being off-limits to humans because they served as communication stations or landing platforms. Mount Hermon, in the Middle East, is mentioned repeatedly in connection with the Watchers, another name for these beings who descended to Earth. Then you have Enlil, the son of Anu, who was given command of Earth operations. His official title in the tablets is Lord of the Command. He established his headquarters in a city called Nippur, which was considered the religious center of Sumer. Archaeologists have excavated Nippur extensively, and what they found is interesting. The city's layout doesn't match typical ancient settlements. It's too organized, too geometrically precise, with what appears to be a raised platform in the center where Enlil's temple once stood. Some researchers suggest this platform might have served a more practical function than just worship, that it might have been a control center or communications hub. Enlil had sons of his own, and this is where the dynastic complications get messy. His legitimate heir was Ninurta, a warrior god often depicted with advanced weapons that don't look like anything used in ancient warfare. But Enlil also had an illegitimate son with a human woman, and this son, named Adad, caused significant political problems. The tablets are full of these kinds of scandals, gods having children with humans, half human, half Anunnaki hybrids, who were stronger and longer lived than regular humans, but not accepted as equals by the pure-blooded Anunnaki. The Bible briefly mentions this in Genesis, when it refers to the Nephilim, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. But the Sumerian texts go into much greater detail about these hybrid bloodlines and how they became the first kings and rulers of human civilization. Enki presents a different profile entirely. While Enlil was the stern administrator, Enki was the scientist, the engineer, the problem solver. His title was Lord of the Earth, and his domain was the Abzu, those underground mining operations in Africa. But he was also credited with designing irrigation systems, teaching humans agriculture, and establishing the first cities. The texts portray him as genuinely fond of his human creations, almost protective of them. There's a passage where Enki is described walking among humans, observing them, and feeling something like pride or compassion. This emotional connection apparently drove many of his decisions to help humanity advance, even when it went against official Anunnaki policy. Enki's relationship with his half-sister Ninhursag is particularly fascinating. She's described as the chief medical officer, the one with expertise in biology and genetics. Together, they conducted the experiments that led to human creation. But their relationship was complicated. Some tablets hint at romance. Others describe professional collaboration. A few suggest bitter disagreements about how humanity should be treated. There's a text describing an argument between them after one of their hybrid experiments produced a being that suffered from severe defects. Ninhursag wanted to terminate the experiment. Enki insisted they continue trying. This back and forth over ethics in genetic engineering, recorded 4,000 years ago, sounds disturbingly contemporary. The tablets describe approximately 600 Anunnaki stationed on Earth at the height of their operations, with another 300 operating from orbital stations or stationed on Mars, which they called Lamu. These weren't just miners and administrators. They had specialized roles: engineers who built structures, pilots who flew craft between Earth and Nibiru, medical personnel who monitored both Anunnaki and human populations, agricultural specialists who developed crops, and warriors, because apparently conflicts between different Anunnaki factions were common, which brings us to something the texts are very clear about. These beings were not unified. They fought among themselves constantly. The tablets describe a bitter rivalry between the clan of Enlil and the clan of Enki that lasted for millennia. This wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was a fundamental disagreement about Earth's future and humanity's role in it. Should humans remain primitive and controlled, or should they be educated and given more freedom? Should Earth's resources belong exclusively to the Anunnaki, or should humans eventually inherit the planet? These questions sparked conflicts that, according to the tablets, sometimes turned violent. One of the most disturbing accounts describes a war fought with weapons that sound frighteningly advanced. The texts mention weapons that tear apart the mountains, brilliant lights that bring death, and poison clouds that burn the lungs. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, mentioned briefly in the Bible, gets a much fuller treatment in Sumerian texts, where it's described as part of a larger conflict between Anunnaki factions. One side unleashed weapons that turned sand to glass, created mushroom-shaped clouds, and left the region uninhabitable for generations. Scientists have found evidence of unusual heat damage and vitrification at sites in the Middle East that some researchers believe could only be explained by nuclear-level temperatures. Let's talk about what these beings actually looked like, because the physical descriptions are remarkably consistent across thousands of tablets and carved reliefs. They were tall, significantly taller than humans. Most estimates based on archaeological art suggest between 7 and 8 feet. Though some texts describe certain individuals as being even larger, they had elongated skulls, large eyes, and pronounced facial features. Their skin is sometimes described as having a luminous quality, and they're often depicted wearing elaborate costumes that might have been protective suits or technological gear, rather than just ceremonial dress. Interestingly, they aged very slowly. A passage in one text describes a human servant noticing that his Anunnaki master looked essentially the same over a period of 50 years, while the human had gone from young to old. This incredible longevity is mentioned repeatedly as one of the key differences between them and us. Some tablets suggest their extended lifespans were natural to their physiology, possibly due to their home planet's different orbital period and environmental conditions. Others hint that they used technology or treatments to extend their lives even further. Their diet was different too. The tablets describe them consuming a food of life and water of life that granted strength and vitality. Humans were generally forbidden from consuming these substances. There's the famous story of Adapa, the wise man brought before Anu, where Enki specifically warns him not to eat or drink what's offered in heaven. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of biological incompatibility, that whatever the Anunnaki consumed might have been toxic to humans, or that they wanted to maintain the biological separation between the two species. But here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Despite their advanced technology and long lives, these beings were not invincible. The tablets record deaths, murders, even. One text describes the trial and execution of an Anunnaki who killed his brother. Another describes deaths from disease. Several mention casualties in wars and accidents. They could be wounded. They felt pain. They experienced fear. In one particularly revealing passage, during the Great Flood, the text describes the Anunnaki fleeing Earth in their skyships, watching from orbit as the waters destroyed everything below. And the text says they cowered like dogs and wept like women at the destruction. These don't sound like all-powerful gods. They sound like mortal beings with technology, caught in a catastrophe they couldn't control. The hierarchy among them was rigid and apparently based on both birthright and function. Anu's bloodline held ultimate authority. Enlil, as the firstborn son through an official consort, commanded Earth operations despite being younger than Enki, who was born to a lesser wife. This caused resentment that echoes through the tablets. Enki was brilliant and capable, but he'd never hold the top position because of his birth status. Sound familiar? It's the kind of political structure you see in human monarchies throughout history, which raises an interesting question. Did we create gods in our image? Or did we create our social structures based on the model the Anunnaki established? Their cities were distributed across the ancient world, each serving specific functions. Eridu, the oldest, was Enki's city and the center of scientific operations. Nippur was the administrative capital under Enlil. Sippar was the spaceport city where craft launched and landed. Badabira was the metallurgical center where ore from the mines was processed. The tablets describe a network of settlements connected by what sounds like sophisticated communication systems. They could contact each other instantly across great distances. They coordinated their activities on a global scale, and they kept meticulous records of everything, which is how we know so much about them today. But then something happened. The tablets become less clear about the exact timeline, but gradually, the Anunnaki presence on Earth diminished. Some texts suggest their mission was complete, and they returned home. Others hint at catastrophic events that forced their departure. A few mention conflicts that made Earth less hospitable for them, and there are cryptic references to their numbers declining, possibly due to an inability to reproduce effectively in Earth's environment, or conflicts that reduced their population. By around 2000 BC, the detailed accounts of direct Anunnaki rule fade from the tablets. Instead, you start seeing references to human kings claiming descent from the gods, ruling in their stead, maintaining their laws and systems. But here's the question that should haunt you. If they left, where did they go? And more importantly, did they really leave at all? Because those same tablets that describe their departure also contain promises, prophecies, assurances that they would return, that the gods who created us would come back someday to reclaim their creation. Every major ancient culture has some version of this prophecy. The return of the gods, the second coming, the day when those who shaped humanity will descend once more from the heavens. And considering they supposedly created us to serve a specific purpose, we have to ask ourselves, if they do come back, what exactly will they expect from us? Picture a prison that doesn't need walls, a containment system so perfectly designed that the inmates don't even realize they're imprisoned. That's the theory we need to examine now, and it's going to make you uncomfortable. Because if Earth really is a prison planet, the evidence isn't just carved on ancient tablets, it's written into our bodies, our planet, and possibly even our consciousness itself. Let's start with something basic. Gravity. We're so used to it that we never question it, but Earth's gravitational pull creates a prison more effective than any steel bars. We're trapped here, completely. Without technology that requires massive amounts of energy and resources, we cannot leave this planet. And even with our best current technology, we've barely made it to our own moon. We're stuck in what scientists call a gravity well. and escaping it requires overcoming forces that consume incredible amounts of fuel and effort. It's almost as if the planet itself is designed to keep us here. Now, compare that to the descriptions of the Anunnaki in the tablets. They traveled between worlds apparently with ease. Their craft are described as crossing vast distances, moving between Earth and Nibiru on regular schedules. Meanwhile, we struggle to put a few humans on Mars, a neighboring planet. Why the dramatic difference in capability? One possibility is that we were never meant to leave, that our biological design includes built-in limitations that keep us bound to this specific rock floating in space. Let's talk about those biological limitations, because they're stranger than you might think. Humans are the only species on Earth that experiences extreme pain during childbirth. Every other mammal gives birth with relative ease. But human women? The process is excruciating, dangerous, and until modern medicine, frequently fatal. Why? The standard explanation is that our large brains and bipedal posture created a mismatch between skull size and birth canal dimensions. But that explanation falls apart when you consider that brain size increased relatively rapidly in evolutionary terms, yet the pelvic structure didn't adapt accordingly. It's almost as if the large brain was added to a body plan that wasn't designed for it. As if someone increased our cognitive capacity without fully redesigning the chassis to accommodate it. Then there's our fragile skin. Unlike virtually every other primate, we're almost completely hairless. We burn easily in sunlight. We're vulnerable to temperature extremes. We dehydrate quickly. Remove a human from climate-controlled shelter and appropriate clothing, and we become remarkably fragile. There's a theory proposed by some researchers that humans show signs of being adapted for an aquatic or semi-aquatic environment, which would explain the hair loss, subcutaneous fat distribution, and our instinctive ability to swim. But there's no evidence we evolved in such an environment on Earth. So, where did these adaptations come from? Unless, of course, the genetic material used to create us came from beings adapted to very different environmental conditions. Our vulnerability to Earth's sun is particularly interesting. We're the only primate that can't spend extended periods in direct sunlight without serious health consequences. Skin cancer, heat stroke, severe burns. Meanwhile, every other primate species can spend their entire lives outdoors without these issues. Some researchers suggest this indicates our genetics might be optimized for a different star, perhaps one with a different spectral output than our sun. It sounds crazy until you remember that the tablets describe the Anunnaki coming from another planet in another part of the solar system, presumably with different solar radiation levels. Let's go deeper into the genetic anomalies, because this is where things get truly weird. In 2003, the Human Genome Project completed the first full mapping of human DNA. What they found puzzled scientists. We have 223 genes that appear nowhere else in the evolutionary tree. Not in primates, not in other mammals. Nowhere. These genes don't show the gradual mutations and changes you'd expect from natural evolution. They appear fully formed, fully functional, as if they were inserted into our genome from an outside source. The official explanation is horizontal gene transfer from bacteria, but even the scientists proposing this admit it's a guess. They don't actually know where these genes came from. Then we have what's been called junk DNA. For decades, scientists believed that 97% of our DNA served no purpose. It was evolutionary leftovers, random sequences that accumulated over millions of years. But recent research has completely overturned that assumption. That so-called junk DNA? It's not junk at all. It contains incredibly complex information, regulatory sequences, activation codes, what looks like dormant programming waiting for the right trigger to switch on. Some geneticists now believe this non-coding DNA might actually be the most important part of our genome, controlling when and how our genes express themselves. But here's the disturbing question. If it's not junk, if it's actually sophisticated code, then why is so much of it turned off? What abilities or characteristics are locked away in that dormant DNA? There's a researcher named Lloyd Pye who spent years studying something he called intervention theory. He collected evidence suggesting that human DNA shows signs of deliberate manipulation. One of his most compelling arguments involves the chromosome 2 fusion I mentioned earlier. In every primate species, chromosomes exist in 24 pairs, for a total of 48. Humans have 23 pairs, 46 total. At some point, 2 of our chromosomes fuse together. You can see the evidence clearly under a microscope. Chromosome 2 in humans has telomeres, the protective caps that belong on chromosome ends, right in the middle where the fusion occurred. It also has 2 centromeres, the attachment points for cell division when it should only have one. Natural chromosome fusion is possible, but it's extremely rare and usually results in severe genetic disorders. Yet in humans, this fusion appears to have happened cleanly, successfully, and became fixed in the entire population. The odds of this happening naturally and spreading to all humans are astronomical. But if someone wanted to modify a primate genome, reducing the chromosome count might be exactly the kind of change they'd make. Fewer chromosomes mean simpler reproduction control. It means genetic changes propagate more predictably. It's the kind of modification a genetic engineer might implement if they were creating a new species from an existing template. Now let's talk about lifespan, because this is where the prison planet theory gets really dark. According to the tablets, the Anunnaki lived for thousands of years. Some passages suggest tens of thousands. Meanwhile, humans are designed to die young. Even with modern medicine, we rarely make it past 100 years. Our cells can only divide a certain number of times before they stop, a limit controlled by telomere shortening. We're programmed to age and die. But here's the thing. That programming isn't universal in nature. Some species show negligible senescence, meaning they don't age in the traditional sense. Certain jellyfish can effectively live forever by reverting to earlier life stages. Some trees live for thousands of years. Bowhead whales can live over 200 years. The biological machinery for extreme longevity exists in nature, so why don't we have it? One possibility is that short lifespans were deliberately engineered into humans. Think about it from a control perspective. If your workforce lived for thousands of years, they'd accumulate knowledge, wisdom, and potentially the organizational capacity to rebel. But if they die after 70 or 80 years, each generation has to relearn everything. Cultural knowledge gets diluted. Revolutionary ideas die with their originators. A short-lived population is much easier to control than a long-lived one. It's the perfect built-in reset button. There's another limitation worth examining: our consciousness itself. Humans use only a tiny fraction of our brain's potential capacity. We have roughly 86 billion neurons, creating trillions of possible connections, yet we operate in a very narrow band of awareness. We perceive only a small slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. We hear only a limited range of frequencies. We're essentially sensory deprived compared to what we could potentially perceive. Some researchers argue this isn't an accident, that our consciousness has been deliberately dampened, filtered, limited to keep us focused on survival and basic tasks, rather than expanding our awareness to levels that might allow us to perceive the true nature of our reality. This connects to what some call the frequency fence, or the consciousness veil. The theory suggests Earth is surrounded by an energetic barrier that keeps human consciousness trapped in lower frequency states characterized by fear, survival instinct, tribal thinking, and material obsession. We're kept in what some researchers call the reptilian brain, the most primitive part of our neural architecture that deals with basic survival. Meanwhile, the higher functions that would allow for expanded consciousness, telepathy, or perception of other dimensions remain largely dormant. Is this biological limitation, or is it something being actively suppressed? Ancient texts from various cultures describe this imprisonment of consciousness. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered in Egypt in 1945, contain passages describing Earth as a prison controlled by beings called archons. These texts say the archons created a false reality, a simulation designed to trap souls in physical bodies and keep them from remembering their true nature. The language is different from the Sumerian tablets, but the core concept is remarkably similar. Humans as imprisoned beings, controlled by forces that benefit from our ignorance and labor. The Nag Hammadi texts describe the chief archon as a being called Yaldabaoth, who creates the material world and humanity as a way to trap divine consciousness in matter. He's described as reptilian in appearance, arrogant, and claiming to be the only god, while being ignorant of higher realms beyond his perception. Sound familiar? The parallels to Enlil from the Sumerian texts are striking. Both are described as rulers of Earth. Both are portrayed as viewing humans as possessions. Both are depicted as wanting to keep humanity ignorant of our true potential. Here's something that should make you pause. Why do humans have such a strong instinctive fear of death? It's hardwired into us at a level deeper than rational thought. This fear drives so much of human behavior. We accumulate wealth to feel secure. We seek power to feel protected. We avoid risks. We stay in line. We obey authority, all because we're terrified of dying. But what if that fear was installed in us? What if beings that live for thousands of years, who view death very differently, deliberately amplified this fear in humans because it makes us easier to control. A population paralyzed by fear of death is a population that will do almost anything to survive, including accepting servitude. The reincarnation trap is another aspect of the prison planet theory that deserves examination. Multiple ancient traditions describe the soul as being forced to reincarnate repeatedly, cycling through life after life on Earth. But what's interesting is that several of these traditions also describe this cycle as a trap, not a natural process. The Tibetan Book of the Dead contains instructions for the dying, warning them not to be deceived by false lights or beings claiming to help them. Some interpretations suggest these warnings are about avoiding being lured back into another physical incarnation before the soul has truly freed itself. The idea is that when we die, we're met by beings or drawn to lights that convince us we need to return to Earth to learn more lessons or pay off karmic debts. We're shown the people we left behind, told they need us. We're made to feel guilty or incomplete, and so we agree to return, to be born again into another physical body, trapped once more in the cycle. But what if this cycle isn't about spiritual growth at all? What if it's a harvesting system, a way to keep consciousness trapped in physical form, generating emotional energy that some beings feed upon? This brings us to the Loosh theory, popularized by researcher Robert Monroe. After years of out-of-body experiences and consciousness exploration, Monroe concluded that Earth might be a farm where human emotional energy, particularly negative emotions like fear and suffering, is harvested by non-physical entities. He called this energy Loosh. The idea is that humans, trapped in physical bodies with short lifespans, constant struggles, and amplified emotions, generate massive amounts of this energy. We're essentially batteries, producing fuel for something else. It sounds insane until you look at how human civilization is structured. We're kept in constant states of stress, fear, competition, and conflict. Our news cycles focus on disasters and tragedies. Our entertainment often centers on violence and suffering. Our economic systems create artificial scarcity and desperation. Our political systems keep us divided and fighting each other. If you wanted to design a system to maximize negative emotional output from a population, this would be pretty close to optimal. And according to the tablets, we were created to work, to serve, to labor endlessly. Maybe that labor isn't just physical. Maybe it's emotional and energetic as well. The prison isn't just the planet. It's our bodies. It's our limited perception. It's our fear of death. It's our shortened lifespans that prevent accumulated wisdom. It's our genetic programming that keeps us focused on survival rather than transcendence. We're trapped in multiple overlapping systems of control, so perfectly integrated that most people never question them. We think this is just how life is. But what if it's how life was designed to be, by beings who needed us to stay exactly where we are, doing exactly what we're doing, for their benefit rather than ours? The tablets tell one story, but what does the physical evidence actually show? This is where skeptics usually feel confident, dismissing the Anunnaki narrative as pure fantasy. Except there's a problem. The archaeological record contains artifacts and sites that shouldn't exist, structures that challenge everything we think we know about ancient human capabilities. And when you map these anomalies against the Sumerian claims, disturbing patterns emerge. Let's start in southern Africa, because that's where the tablets say the gold mining operations were centered. In the 1970s, a mining company operating in South Africa discovered something that made no sense. Ancient mining shafts. Really ancient. Not hundreds of years old. Not thousands. These mines dated back between 100,000 and 200,000 years. Some estimates push even earlier. The problem? According to mainstream archaeology, humans in that period were barely using stone tools. We certainly weren't conducting organized mining operations with tunnels, support structures, and evidence of systematic ore extraction. Michael Tellinger, a South African researcher and author, has spent decades documenting these sites. He's found hundreds of ancient mines scattered across southern Africa, many of them in areas that show evidence of intense gold mining activity. But here's what makes it weirder. Near these ancient mines, Tellinger discovered something else. Massive stone circle structures, hundreds of thousands of them, covering an area larger than California. These aren't random rock formations. They're precisely constructed circular ruins, often connected by stone channels, arranged in clear patterns across the landscape. Most are now buried or overgrown, visible only from aerial surveys. The conventional explanation is that these are cattle enclosures built by Bantu peoples maybe a few hundred years ago. But radiocarbon dating of some sites suggests they're far older. and the construction style doesn't match known Bantu architecture. The stones are often enormous, moved without mortar or binding, fitted together with techniques that resemble megalithic sites around the world. Tellinger's theory? These were settlements for the mining workforce. The primitive workers described in the tablets, humans created to extract gold from the earth and process it at nearby facilities. Now let's jump to a site that should be impossible, Pumapunku in Bolivia. This is part of the larger Tiwanaku complex, sitting at 13,000 feet above sea level in the Andes Mountains. The precision of the stonework at Pumapunku is so extreme that modern engineers struggle to explain it. We're talking about perfectly flat surfaces machined to tolerances of a few micrometers, perfectly straight edges hundreds of feet long, precise 90-degree angles cut into stone blocks weighing over 100 tons, geometric patterns that interlock like three-dimensional puzzles. The stone used is andesite and granite, some of the hardest materials on Earth. Shaping these stones to this level of precision would require diamond-tipped tools at minimum. Bronze and copper tools, which are what mainstream archaeology says were available, would be utterly useless. And yet there it sits, undeniably real, constructed according to official dating somewhere between 500 and 1500 AD. Although some researchers argue the site is much older, possibly dating back over 12,000 years, based on astronomical alignments and water erosion patterns. What makes Pumapunku relevant to our discussion is this. The precision engineering on display there matches descriptions in Sumerian texts of structures built by the Anunnaki, perfectly cut stones, massive weights moved and positioned with apparent ease, geometric precision that suggests advanced mathematical knowledge. And the site sits in a region where ancient South American legends describe gods who came from the sky, taught humans advanced techniques, and then departed with promises to return. Different culture, same story. Then there's Baalbek in Lebanon. The Temple of Jupiter sits atop a foundation platform that includes the largest worked stones ever moved by humans. The three stones, called the Trilithon, each weigh approximately 800 tons. That's 1.6 million pounds per stone. Modern cranes max out at around 100 tons for safe operation. Specialized heavy lift cranes can manage more, but they require extensive setup, reinforced ground, and careful engineering. Yet someone moved these 800-ton blocks, lifted them 20 feet off the ground, and placed them with such precision that you can't slide a piece of paper between them. Below the Trilithon, in an even older layer, sits a stone called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. This single block weighs roughly 1,000 tons. It's still partially attached to the bedrock in a nearby quarry, cut and shaped but never moved, which raises the question, if ancient humans couldn't move it, why did they cut it? Unless, of course, they weren't the ones who cut it. Unless beings with technology far beyond Bronze Age capabilities were responsible. The official explanation for how these stones were moved involves thousands of workers, rolling logs, sleds, and incredible coordination. But engineers who've studied the problem point out that the friction alone would require impossibly large workforces, and the slightest mistake would result in catastrophic loss of life and destruction of the stone. Some researchers suggest the only plausible explanation is technology we don't understand. Perhaps acoustic levitation, electromagnetic manipulation, or methods that sound like science fiction but might be ancient science we've forgotten or never possessed. Let's talk about the Great Pyramid of Giza, because despite hundreds of years of study, we still can't definitively explain how it was built. The official story is that 20,000 to 30,000 workers spent 20 years stacking 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, to create a structure 481 feet tall, with a base covering 13 acres. The precision is absurd. The base is level to within less than an inch across a span of over 230 meters. The sides align to the cardinal directions within a few hundredths of a degree. The internal passages maintain consistent angles and dimensions over hundreds of feet. But here's what bothers researchers who look closely. The mainstream timeline places the Great Pyramid's construction around 2500 BC under Pharaoh Khufu. Yet there's no contemporary Egyptian text that describes its construction, no detailed records of the engineering techniques used, no documentation of the massive workforce that would have been required. What we have instead is silence from the Egyptians themselves, and much later legends claiming the pyramids were built by gods or giants in a time before the pharaohs. Even ancient Egyptian historians like Manetho wrote about dynasties of gods who ruled Egypt before human kings, spanning thousands of years. The inventory stela, discovered in the 1800s near the Great Pyramid, contains inscriptions suggesting the Sphinx and pyramids already existed when Khufu came to power. He supposedly performed restoration work, not original construction. If true, this pushes the age of these monuments back significantly, possibly into a period when, according to mainstream archaeology, humans were still figuring out basic agriculture. Unless, of course, humans weren't the original builders. There's also the mystery of the pyramid's interior construction. The king's chamber contains massive granite beams weighing 50 to 80 tons each, transported from quarries 500 miles away, and somehow lifted 350 feet into the air and maneuvered through narrow passages. The tolerances in the chamber's construction are so precise that modern laser measurement equipment shows variations of less than a millimeter across surfaces dozens of feet wide. This level of precision wasn't achieved in Western construction until the Industrial Revolution. Some researchers point to what's called the agricultural impossibility of pyramid construction. To feed a workforce of 20 to 30,000 people for 20 years, you'd need massive agricultural surplus. But climate data and Nile flood records from that period suggest Egypt was actually experiencing drought conditions. The logistics of feeding, housing, and coordinating that many workers would have required infrastructure and organization, we have no evidence existed at that time. Unless you accept that the workforce wasn't actually human, or that the construction timeline is completely wrong. Now let's examine the genetic archaeological evidence, because this might be the most disturbing piece of the puzzle. In 1991, a team of geneticists, led by Dr. Francis Crick, who co-discovered DNA structure, published a paper examining the human genome's complexity. Their conclusion shocked many people. They calculated that the probability of DNA evolving by random chance within Earth's timeline was statistically impossible. Crick himself proposed a theory called directed panspermia, suggesting that life on Earth might have been deliberately seeded by an extraterrestrial intelligence. He was essentially saying that our genetic code shows signs of design, not random evolution. Then, in 2001, the Human Genome Project revealed those 223 genes I mentioned earlier that don't appear anywhere else in nature. Dr. Maxim Makukov and Vladimir Sherbak went even further. They published research suggesting that DNA contains what they call arithmetic and ideographic symbolic language embedded within the genetic code. They argue this represents a signature of whoever designed the code, like a manufacturer's stamp. Their peer-reviewed paper claimed to have found what amounts to a wow signal inside human DNA, a pattern so specific and non-random that it suggests intentional placement by an intelligent source. The chromosome 2 fusion is documented, undeniable, and according to geneticists who've studied it intensively, shows hallmarks of artificial genetic engineering rather than natural evolution. Dr. Maxim Frank Kamenetsky, a molecular biologist, has written that the fusion appears too clean, too successful, and too perfectly propagated to have occurred naturally. He stops short of claiming alien intervention, but he admits the natural explanation requires accepting some extraordinary coincidences. Then there are the elongated skulls found across the ancient world. Peru, Egypt, Malta, and dozens of other locations have yielded hundreds of skulls with dramatically elongated cranial structures. The mainstream explanation is cranial deformation, a practice where infant skulls are bound to create the elongated shape. This practice definitely occurred in some cultures, but here's the problem. Some of these skulls don't just show deformation of existing bone structure, they show increased cranial capacity, different bone plate arrangements, and in some cases, genetic markers that don't match modern human populations. DNA analysis performed on Paracas skulls from Peru revealed something startling. The samples contained mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any human population. The geneticist who performed the analysis stated that the results suggest a completely new hominid lineage, something outside the known human family tree. This data hasn't been widely accepted by mainstream science, primarily because it doesn't fit existing models. But, if accurate, it would support the tablet claims of hybrid human Anunnaki bloodlines, beings that looked mostly human but had significant genetic differences. Archaeological sites around the world show evidence of advanced metallurgy that shouldn't have existed when they were supposedly built. The Egyptians worked with copper and bronze, yet somehow created perfectly smooth granite vases with long, narrow necks and hollow interiors that would require rotary tools and precision bits to manufacture. The Inca fitted massive stones together so precisely that modern attempts to replicate the technique have failed, even with diamond cutting tools. Sites in Turkey, like Göbekli Tepe, show sophisticated astronomical knowledge and massive stone construction dating back 11,000 to 600 years, to a time when humans supposedly lived in small hunter-gatherer bands. Every one of these anomalies can be explained away individually if you're willing to accept unlikely coincidences and give ancient humans credit for capabilities we have no evidence they possessed. But when you step back and look at the pattern, when you see the global distribution of impossibly precise stonework, genetic anomalies, and massive engineering projects, all dating to periods described in ancient texts as the time of the gods, the conventional explanations start to strain credibility. Maybe, just maybe, the tablets aren't mythology. Maybe they're technical documentation, archaeological reports from a time when beings with advanced technology walked the earth and reshaped both the landscape and the very genetic code of the species they created to serve them. So we arrive at the question that should terrify us. If the tablets are accurate, if we really were engineered by the Anunnaki, then what exactly were we made for? The answer in the texts is brutally simple: labor. We were biological machines created to perform tasks that the Anunnaki no longer wanted to do themselves. Mining gold, tending fields, building structures, serving the gods. That was our original programming, our designed purpose. But here's what keeps me up at night. What if that purpose never actually ended? The tablets describe early humans working in the mines and fields, essentially as slaves. We had no concept of freedom because we'd never experienced it. We simply did what we were told. The texts say we were created without the ability to reproduce initially. Ninhursag made the first humans sterile, ensuring complete control over the population. Only later, according to one story, did Enki secretly modify our genetics to grant us reproductive capability. This act of rebellion against Enlil's authority gave humans the ability to multiply beyond the Anunnaki's direct control. And that's when the problem started. Think about what it means to be created as a tool. You don't have inherent rights. You don't have autonomy. Your desires, your suffering, your dreams, they're all irrelevant because you exist solely to fulfill someone else's needs. The tablets don't describe the Anunnaki discussing human happiness or fulfillment. They describe us the way you might describe a tractor, useful when working properly, a problem when it breaks down or stops functioning. There's a chilling passage where the gods complain that humans have become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing their rest. The solution discussed isn't to relocate or to adapt. It's to reduce the human population through plagues and ultimately through flood. We were an appliance that had gotten out of control. But let's fast forward to today. The Anunnaki supposedly left Earth thousands of years ago. Their direct rule ended. Humans developed our own civilizations, our own governments, our own sense of autonomy. We're free now, right? Except when you look at how human society actually functions, you start to notice something disturbing. We're still performing the same role. We're still extracting resources from the earth. We're still building monuments to wealth and power. We're still serving an elite class that benefits from our labor while we struggle to survive. Consider the modern work paradigm. The average person spends 40 to 50 hours per week working, not because they love their job, not because it fulfills some deep purpose, but because they need money to survive, to pay for shelter, for food, for the basic necessities that should arguably be freely available on a planet with abundant resources. We trade our time, our energy, our life force for currency that allows us to continue existing. We mine gold, metaphorically speaking, just like our ancestors did literally. Except now the gold is called productivity, economic output, shareholder value. The system is designed to keep us perpetually busy, perpetually stressed, perpetually focused on survival, rather than on questioning the nature of reality or our place in it. When you're worried about making rent, you're not contemplating whether consciousness might extend beyond physical death. When you're exhausted from working multiple jobs, you're not researching ancient tablets that suggest humanity might be enslaved. The system keeps us trapped in what researchers call the survival frequency, the lowest level of consciousness where all that matters is food, shelter, safety, and reproduction. The same level where the tablets describe the earliest humans operating. There's a concept in ancient religions and mystical traditions called worship as energy transfer. The idea that when humans pray, when they prostrate themselves before deities, when they offer sacrifices and devotion, they're actually transferring energy, not metaphorical energy, actual energetic currency that these beings consume or utilize. Every ancient culture practiced some form of worship that involved ritual, often daily, directed toward gods who demanded it. The gods needed worship. They required it. They became angry when they didn't receive it. Why would all-powerful beings need anything from primitive humans unless that worship was providing something valuable? The tablets are explicit about this. The Anunnaki established religious centers. They demanded sacrifices. They required humans to work in their temples, preparing food offerings, maintaining facilities, performing rituals. The text describes this as humans feeding the gods, serving the gods, pleasing the gods through labor and devotion. And what happens in every human civilization that develops? Religion. Organized systems of worship that demand time, energy, resources, and complete devotion to beings described as residing in heaven. The names change, the specific rituals change, but the fundamental structure remains identical across cultures and centuries. Now, extend this to the modern era. We might not call it worship anymore, but examine what we actually do. We devote ourselves to corporations, to institutions, to systems of power that demand our loyalty and labor. We pursue wealth and status with religious fervor. We sacrifice our health, our relationships, our happiness in service to economic systems that benefit a tiny elite while the masses struggle. We're still serving. We've just changed what we call the masters. Robert Monroe's Loosh theory suggests something even darker. That human emotional energy, particularly negative emotions, represents a form of food or fuel for non-physical entities. He described Earth as a farm where humans are the crop, generating this energy through suffering, fear, conflict, and struggle. Every war, every tragedy, every moment of anguish creates a burst of intense emotional energy. And if beings exist that can perceive and utilize this energy, then maintaining humanity in a state of constant low-level suffering with periodic spikes of intense trauma would be the optimal farming strategy. Look at how human civilization is structured through this lens. We're kept in artificial scarcity despite living on a planet with abundant resources. We're divided into competing groups, nations, religions, political tribes, ensuring constant conflict. Our news media focuses obsessively on tragedy and disaster, keeping us marinating in fear and anxiety. Our entertainment industry produces endless content centered on violence, horror, and suffering. We're bombarded with messages designed to make us feel inadequate, fearful, envious, and angry. If you wanted to maximize negative emotional output from a population, this would be the playbook. The reincarnation cycle, if it exists as a trap rather than a spiritual learning opportunity, represents the ultimate prison. You live a life of struggle and labor. You die exhausted and confused. And then, before you can fully remember who and what you really are, you're convinced or coerced into returning for another round. The beings managing this system show you your loved ones still on Earth. They make you feel guilty for leaving. They tell you that you have unfinished karma, lessons to learn, debts to pay, and so you agree to return, to be born again into a physical body with all memories erased, ready to generate another 70 or 80 years of emotional energy and physical labor. Multiple ancient texts warn about this cycle. The Gnostic Gospels describe archons who trap souls at death, preventing them from escaping to higher realms. Tibetan Buddhism teaches techniques for navigating the bardo, the state between death and rebirth, specifically to avoid being tricked into automatic reincarnation. Even Plato's myth of describes souls being forced to drink from the river of forgetfulness before returning to physical life. These warnings appear across cultures separated by thousands of miles and years. Either humanity independently invented the same paranoid fantasy everywhere, or we're all remembering something real. Something about the true nature of this existence that we're not supposed to remember. Here's a question that should disturb you deeply. Why do we forget? Why is every human born with complete amnesia about any previous existence, any knowledge of what we are beyond these physical bodies? If reincarnation is real and beneficial, why wouldn't we remember our past lives? Why wouldn't we retain the wisdom and knowledge accumulated over multiple lifetimes? The only logical answer is that the forgetting serves someone's purpose. That erasing our memories each cycle keeps us vulnerable, controllable, and perpetually starting from zero. It's the ultimate control mechanism. You can't escape a prison if you don't remember you're imprisoned. The tablets describe the Anunnaki creating humans to be workers, to serve, to obey. They describe us being genetically limited, designed with short lifespans and restricted consciousness. They describe religious systems being established to maintain control. And when we look at human civilization today, thousands of years after the Anunnaki supposedly left, we see those same patterns still firmly in place. We work, We serve, we obey, we struggle, we generate wealth and resources that flow upward to a small elite. We produce emotional energy through our suffering and conflicts. We remain trapped in limited consciousness, focused on survival rather than transcendence. So what is our purpose? According to the tablets, we were made to mine gold. But maybe that's too literal an interpretation. Maybe the mining was always metaphorical. Maybe what's being extracted from humanity isn't just physical resources, but something far more valuable: our energy, our consciousness, our creative potential channeled into systems that benefit others while keeping us perpetually exhausted, perpetually struggling, perpetually asleep to our true nature and capabilities. We are, perhaps, still doing exactly what we were designed to do, still serving the purpose we were created for, generation after generation, never quite waking up enough to ask who benefits from our endless labor and whether we might have the power to stop. The mainstream scientific establishment has a very clear position on all of this. Ancient astronaut theories are pseudoscience. The Sumerian tablets are mythology, not history. Any suggestion that human DNA was artificially manipulated is fringe nonsense. And yet, when you actually examine what modern science has discovered, the picture becomes far more complicated than the official dismissals suggest. Let's start with what scientists will openly admit puzzles them. Human evolution shows a pattern that doesn't quite fit standard Darwinian models. Evolution typically proceeds gradually through small incremental changes over vast time periods. But the emergence of Homo sapiens shows something different. Around 300,000 years ago, a species appeared with a brain nearly triple the size of its predecessors. This wasn't a gradual increase. The fossil record shows a relatively sudden jump in cranial capacity, cognitive ability, and behavioral complexity. Paleoanthropologists call this the Great Leap Forward, and they genuinely don't have a satisfying explanation for what caused it. Dr. Ian Tattersall, curator emeritus at the American Museum of Natural History, has written extensively about this problem. He points out that the standard narrative of smooth evolutionary progression from apes to humans is contradicted by the actual fossil evidence. Instead, we see long periods of stasis interrupted by sudden appearances of new traits. The transition to modern humans happened too quickly and too completely to fit comfortable within purely natural selection models. Tattersall stops short of proposing intervention, but he acknowledges that something unusual happened in human evolution that we don't fully understand. Then there's the molecular biology. Those 223 genes that appear in humans but nowhere else in the primate lineage remain unexplained. The official hypothesis is horizontal gene transfer from bacteria, a process where genetic material moves between species through mechanisms other than reproduction. But here's the problem with that explanation. Horizontal gene transfer from bacteria to complex animals is extremely rare, and when it does occur, it typically involves single genes, not hundreds. And these particular genes aren't bacterial in nature. They're complex, regulatory genes that control development and neural function. Their sudden appearance in our genome approximately a few 100,000 years ago remains one of genetics' genuine mysteries. Dr. Francis Collins, who directed the Human Genome Project, made an interesting statement when the initial mapping was completed. He said the human genome looked like it had been designed with economy and elegance, showing optimization that exceeded what random mutation would typically produce. He attributed this to natural selection's effectiveness, but other geneticists noted that the level of optimization suggested something more directed. The genome contains what information theorists call irreducible complexity in certain systems, structures so interdependent that they couldn't have evolved incrementally because intermediate stages would be non-functional. Michael Behe, a biochemist, has built his career around documenting these irreducibly complex systems. While he argues for intelligent design from a theistic perspective, his core observation stands regardless of who or what did the designing. Certain biological systems appear engineered rather than evolved. The eye, the blood clotting cascade, the bacterial flagellum motor, and potentially aspects of human consciousness and cognition. The scientific community largely rejects his conclusions, but they struggle to provide step-by-step evolutionary pathways for the systems he highlights. The junk DNA revelation represents another crack in the official narrative. For decades, the fact that 97% of human DNA didn't code for proteins was considered evidence of evolution's messy, wasteful process. But starting in 2012, the ENCODE project published findings showing that this non-coding DNA is actually highly functional. It contains regulatory elements, switches that control when and how genes activate. It's essentially the operating system underlying the genetic code. And here's what's interesting. This regulatory system is far more complex than the genes themselves. It's exactly what you'd expect if someone wanted to create a flexible, controllable biological platform that could be modified and upgraded. Some researchers have gone further. Dr. Maxim Makukov's paper on arithmetic patterns in DNA suggests that the genetic code contains what he calls precision-type patterns and symbolic language that are statistically unlikely to occur naturally. His analysis found repeated mathematical sequences embedded in the nucleotide structure that don't serve biological function, but appear to be signatures or watermarks. When you design something complex, you often include a signature identifying the creator. Makukov argues that's what these patterns represent, evidence of authorship embedded in the code itself. Neuroscience presents its own mysteries. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each capable of thousands of connections. The computational capacity this represents is staggering, yet we use only a fraction of it. Cognitive scientists have long debated what percentage of our brain's capacity we actually utilize. The old myth of 10% has been debunked, but even conservative estimates suggest we're nowhere near full utilization. Why would evolution produce a brain with vast unused capacity? That's incredibly inefficient. Unless the capacity isn't unused but rather dormant, waiting for activation that we've either forgotten how to trigger or that was deliberately suppressed. Studies on savants and individuals with extraordinary abilities provide glimpses of what human brains might be capable of. People who can perform complex mathematical calculations instantly. Individuals who remember everything they've ever experienced with perfect clarity. Artists who can reproduce detailed cityscapes after a single helicopter flyover. These abilities exist in the human neurological architecture. They're not supernatural. They're biological capacities that occasionally manifest when typical inhibitory systems malfunction or are bypassed. This suggests that most humans have these capabilities locked away, inaccessible under normal circumstances. The question is why? Dr. Rick Strassman's research on DMT, a naturally occurring compound in the human brain, revealed something fascinating. When subjects were given DMT in controlled settings, many reported encounters with apparently intelligent entities who seemed to recognize them. They described receiving information, undergoing examinations, and being told they'd forgotten their true nature. Strassman, initially skeptical, eventually acknowledged that the consistency of these reports across subjects suggested something more than random hallucinations. Whether these entities are aspects of our own consciousness or genuinely separate beings remains debated. But the fact that our brains produce a molecule that consistently induces these experiences is curious. It's as if we have built-in hardware for perceiving realities beyond ordinary consciousness. The scientific resistance to ancient astronaut theories isn't primarily about evidence. It's about implications. If human origins involve extraterrestrial intervention, it overturns not just anthropology, but our entire self-concept as a species. It challenges religious narratives. It raises uncomfortable questions about autonomy and purpose. And perhaps most threatening to establishment science, it suggests that ancient people possessed knowledge we've lost, that history isn't a simple progression from primitive to advanced, but rather a cycle of rises and falls with advanced civilizations potentially predating our own. Academics who dare to seriously investigate these possibilities face career consequences. Dr. John Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning psychiatrist at Harvard, began researching alien abduction phenomena in the early 90s. His work was rigorous and scientifically sound, but it threatened mainstream narratives. Harvard launched an unprecedented investigation into his work, essentially an academic witch hunt designed to discredit him. He was eventually exonerated, but the message was clear. Some subjects are off limits, regardless of evidence. Zecharia Sitchin faced similar treatment. Mainstream scholars dismissed his translations of Sumerian texts as wildly inaccurate, yet few of them could read Sumerian well enough to actually verify their criticisms. When linguists did examine his work closely, they found his translations were generally accurate, even if his interpretations were controversial. The dismissal of his work was less about scholarship and more about the unacceptability of his conclusions. Here's what's undeniable. Modern science has discovered anomalies in human genetics that don't fit clean evolutionary models. We found evidence of sudden, dramatic changes in human cognitive capacity. We've documented biological systems that appear designed rather than evolved. We've mapped non-coding DNA that looks like sophisticated programming, and we've discovered that human consciousness has capabilities we're only beginning to understand. most of which remain dormant in ordinary people. None of this proves the Anunnaki existed. None of this definitively confirms that humans were genetically engineered. But it does something, perhaps more important. It demonstrates that the mainstream narrative is incomplete, that there are genuine mysteries in human origins that haven't been satisfactorily explained, and that dismissing ancient texts as pure mythology might be premature. Science is supposed to follow evidence wherever it leads, but when that evidence threatens foundational assumptions about human history and our place in the cosmos, the tendency is to ignore or suppress rather than investigate, which makes you wonder what they're really afraid we might discover if we look too closely at what the ancient tablets actually say. If the Sumerian account was isolated, if only one ancient culture told stories about beings from the sky who created humans and shaped early civilization, you could dismiss it as local mythology. But that's not what we find. When you survey ancient cultures across the planet, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, you discover the same core narrative appearing again and again, with remarkable consistency. Different names, different languages, but the same essential story. Start with the flood. Over 200 cultures worldwide have detailed flood legends describing a catastrophic deluge that destroyed most of humanity. The details align in ways that statistical coincidence can't explain. A divine warning given to one righteous man, instructions to build a large boat, the salvation of his family and animals, floodwaters covering the earth, the boat coming to rest on a mountain, the sending of birds to find dry land. And most disturbingly, the reason for the flood is almost always the same. The gods became angry with humanity's numbers, noise, or corruption, and decided to reset the experiment. The Sumerian version predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, possibly much more, but similar stories appear in ancient India, China, Greece, Australia, and among native peoples of the Americas who had no contact with Middle Eastern civilizations. The Hopi tell of multiple world destructions by water. The Aztecs describe 4 previous worlds, each destroyed when the gods became dissatisfied. Greek mythology includes Deucalion's flood. Hindu texts describe Manu being warned by a fish avatar to build a boat before the world is cleansed. These aren't vague similarities, they're the same story, preserved independently across the globe. The geological record actually supports a catastrophic flood event. Evidence suggests that around 11,600 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically as ice sheets melted. But there's also evidence of more sudden, localized catastrophes. The Black Sea was once a freshwater lake until the Mediterranean breached natural barriers and flooded the basin rapidly, possibly within months. Underwater archaeology has found evidence of submerged settlements around the world, cities that were thriving when sea levels were lower. Graham Hancock has documented dozens of these sites, suggesting advanced civilizations existed before the flood and were largely destroyed by it. Now consider the pyramid phenomenon. Egypt's pyramids are famous, but they're not unique. Massive pyramidal structures appear in Mexico, Central America, Peru, China, Indonesia, and even Bosnia, according to controversial but compelling surveys. The construction styles vary, but the basic form, a massive stepped or smooth-sided pyramidal mountain, appears across cultures that supposedly never had contact. The Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan, Mexico, has a base almost identical in size to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Both are precisely aligned to cardinal directions. Both incorporate sophisticated mathematical proportions. Why pyramids? The standard explanation is that it's a naturally stable structure, easy to build tall, but that doesn't explain the similarities in astronomical alignments, internal chamber designs, and the fact that many of these structures appear to have been built during similar time periods despite being separated by oceans. The shaft in the Great Pyramid points to Orion's belt. The pyramids at Teotihuacan align with the same constellation. The Bosnian pyramids, if legitimate, show similar stellar orientations. Either humans worldwide independently became obsessed with the same stars and the same architectural form, or someone taught this knowledge to multiple cultures. The serpent god motif is perhaps the most disturbing global connection. In Sumer, you have Enki associated with serpents, depicted with snake imagery. In Egypt, the pharaohs wore the uraeus, a cobra symbol representing divine power. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is credited with teaching civilization to humans. In India, the Nagas are divine serpent beings of great wisdom. In China, dragon kings ruled in ancient times and interbred with humans to create royal bloodlines. In Australia, the rainbow serpent created the world and humanity. In Africa, the Chitauri are reptilian beings who control humanity from the shadows, according to Zulu tradition. Why serpents? Why would cultures across every continent associate their creator gods or civilizing figures with reptilian imagery? Snakes aren't universally revered, they're actually feared in most cultures. Yet serpent symbolism connected to divine knowledge, creation, and rulership appears everywhere in the ancient world. The Bible even preserves this motif with the serpent in Eden offering knowledge that God wanted humans to not possess. The Greek caduceus, two serpents wrapped around a staff, remains the symbol of medicine today. The Kundalini serpent in Hindu and Buddhist traditions represents awakened consciousness. Some researchers, like David Icke, have taken this to controversial extremes, arguing that reptilian beings literally control human civilization. But even setting aside such claims, the symbolic consistency demands explanation. Either humanity everywhere independently chose serpents to represent divine power and hidden knowledge, or this symbolism was inherited from a common source. A source that either was reptilian in appearance or chose to represent itself that way. Then there are the sky gods, universally described as coming from above, arriving in flying vehicles, and eventually departing with promises to return. The Sumerian Anunnaki descended from the heavens. The biblical Elohim came from the sky. Hindu texts describe Vimanas, flying palaces of the gods with detailed technical specifications for their construction and operation. These texts describe aerial battles fought with advanced weapons. They describe vehicles that could travel underwater, through air, and into space. The level of detail suggests these aren't pure fantasy but descriptions of witnessed technology. Native American traditions speak of star people who came from the sky, taught humans, and departed. Polynesian legends describe gods arriving from beyond the horizon, in great boats or flying vehicles. Japanese Shinto texts mention beings descending from the heavens to establish the imperial bloodline. The cargo cults of Melanesia provide a modern parallel. When Western aircraft arrived during World War II, isolated islanders who had never seen such technology interpreted the planes and their cargo as divine gifts. They built replica runways and aircraft from local materials, performing rituals to make the gods return with more cargo. This demonstrates how technologically primitive people naturally interpret advanced technology as magic or divine power. What if ancient humans had exactly the same reaction? What if the beings they called gods were simply visitors with technology sufficiently advanced to appear magical? Arthur C. Clarke's third law states that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. To someone in 3000 BC, an aircraft would be a flying chariot of the gods. Genetic engineering would be the divine act of creation. Radio communication would be telepathy or divine omniscience. The ancient texts might be surprisingly accurate descriptions of real events, filtered through the limited vocabulary and conceptual framework available to witnesses. The global distribution of these stories, symbols, and structures suggests one of three possibilities. Either humanity everywhere independently invented the same mythologies and built the same monumental architecture by pure coincidence, or there was a global civilization in deep prehistory that spread this knowledge before being destroyed, perhaps in the flood, or beings from elsewhere shared this knowledge with multiple human cultures, establishing similar religious and social structures to maintain control across the planet. The Sumerian tablets suggest the third option, that the Anunnaki and their associates didn't just rule Mesopotamia, they divided the earth into regions, each governed by different members of their ruling families, which would explain why the same essential story appears globally, because it wasn't mythology, it was history, recorded by civilizations across the world, all describing the same events from their local perspective. We've examined the tablets, we've looked at the archaeology, we've considered the genetic evidence and the global connections. But now we have to confront the questions that keep researchers awake at night. The questions that don't have comfortable answers. Questions that force us to reconsider everything we think we know about our reality and our place in it. First and most immediate, if the Anunnaki left Earth thousands of years ago, where did they go? The tablets mention Nibiru, their home planet, described as having an elliptical orbit that brings it close to Earth every 3,600 years. Astronomers have searched for evidence of such a planet. Some claim Planet 9, hypothesized to exist beyond Neptune based on gravitational effects, might be related. Others dismiss Nibiru entirely as impossible physics. But the question remains, if these beings were real, if they had the technology to travel between worlds, did they simply abandon their mining operation and their created workforce? Or did they leave infrastructure, monitoring systems, perhaps even representatives behind? There's a more disturbing possibility. What if they never actually left? Ancient texts repeatedly mention gods living among humans, disguised or hidden. What if bloodlines exist that carry significant Anunnaki genetics? The tablets describe interbreeding between Anunnaki and humans, creating hybrid offspring. These hybrids became the first kings, the rulers of early civilizations. Royal families throughout history have been obsessed with bloodline purity, with maintaining specific genetic lineages through careful breeding. Why? The official answer involves property and power transfer. But what if it's about preserving something else? What if certain bloodlines carry activation codes, genetic keys that provide capabilities or connections the rest of humanity lacks? Conspiracy researchers often discuss the concept of bloodline elites controlling human civilization, families whose wealth and power persist across centuries, operating behind the scenes of governments and institutions. If you accept the Anunnaki narrative, this stops being conspiracy and starts being potential lineage management. The tablets describe the Anunnaki establishing kingship as a gift to humanity, selecting specific individuals to rule in their stead. What if that system never ended? What if the power structures governing our world today trace back to those original bloodline selections made thousands of years ago? Here's a question that should genuinely disturb you. If we were created to serve, to extract resources, and generate energy for someone else's benefit, who's collecting now? Global economic systems funnel wealth upward to smaller and smaller groups. Human labor and natural resources are extracted continuously, converted into profit that accumulates at the top. We're told this is capitalism, natural market forces. But zoom out, look at the pattern. Billions of humans laboring constantly, producing far more than they consume, with the surplus flowing to elite groups who control financial systems, land, resources. It looks suspiciously like the system described in the tablets, a workforce extracting value from the planet, with the benefit going elsewhere. And what about consciousness farming? If the Loosh theory has merit, if entities exist that feed on human emotional energy, then the question becomes, who's managing the farm? Our world is structured to maximize suffering, fear, conflict, and struggle, not occasionally, constantly, as if maintaining these emotional states in the population serves a purpose beyond simple control. Every war, every economic crisis, every manufactured division keeps humanity generating intense negative emotion. If beings exist that can harvest this energy, they've created the perfect production system, and we're the product. The reincarnation trap raises perhaps the darkest question. What if, when we die, we're not actually free? Multiple ancient traditions warn about false lights, deceptive entities, and traps designed to convince souls to return to physical incarnation. What if death isn't an escape from this prison but simply a transition to another phase of the same cycle? You die, you enter a confused state, you're shown visions designed to manipulate you emotionally, and you agree to return for another lifetime of labor and energy production, the ultimate renewable resource. Consciousness, trapped in an endless cycle, generating value for others while never achieving lasting freedom, or remembering the true nature of the trap. But here's where it gets interesting. If all of this is true, if humanity really is imprisoned and controlled, why are we having this conversation? Why are ancient texts being translated and published? Why are researchers uncovering evidence and sharing it despite professional consequences? There's a growing awakening happening. More people questioning official narratives, more people examining ancient wisdom, more people experiencing expanded consciousness, and recognizing that something is fundamentally wrong with how our world operates. Is this awakening accidental, or is it part of a larger cycle? Some researchers suggest we're approaching a point where the control systems are weakening, that human consciousness is evolving beyond the frequencies that keep us trapped. The Hopi prophecy speaks of the end of the fourth world and the emergence of the fifth. The Mayan calendar marked 2012 as the end of a major cycle. Hindu texts describe the end of Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, and transition to a new era. Are these coincidental myths, or are they all pointing to the same thing? A shift point. A moment when the prison doors might actually crack open. The tablets themselves contain prophecies, descriptions of the gods returning, not as myths, as events, beings descending from the sky, reclaiming their creation, instituting a new order. Is that a promise or a threat? And most importantly, if they do return, will they find a humanity still locked in unconscious servitude, ready to resume our original purpose? Or will they find something unexpected, a species that remembered, that woke up, that reclaimed abilities and sovereignty that were supposed to remain dormant forever? These questions don't have answers yet, but the fact that we're asking them might be the most important thing we can do. So here we are, after examining thousands of years of evidence, multiple lines of inquiry, and patterns that repeat across cultures and centuries, we're left with a choice. We can dismiss all of this as coincidence, as misinterpretation, as the fantasies of ancient people who didn't understand the world around them. That's the comfortable option, the one that lets us continue believing the story we've been told about human origins, purpose, and destiny. Or we can sit with the discomfort of considering that maybe, just maybe, the tablets are telling us something true. Let's be clear about what we've actually established. The Sumerian tablets exist. They describe in detail the creation of humans through genetic manipulation by beings called the Anunnaki. These texts are not vague mythology, but specific accounts with names, dates, locations, and procedures. The archaeological record contains structures and artifacts that challenge mainstream explanations of ancient human capabilities. Our own DNA contains anomalies that geneticists struggle to explain through natural evolution alone, and globally, separated cultures tell remarkably similar stories about sky gods, creation, catastrophic floods, and the promise of return. None of this constitutes absolute proof. We don't have an Anunnaki specimen to examine. We don't have their technology to reverse engineer. We can't definitively demonstrate that human DNA was artificially modified rather than naturally evolved. But we have something perhaps more valuable. We have patterns, consistencies, evidence that doesn't fit the official narrative but fits the ancient accounts remarkably well. The uncomfortable truth is that we might be exactly what the tablets say we are. A created species, designed for a specific purpose, limited by design to keep us controllable, trapped in cycles of labor, suffering, and rebirth that serve interests beyond our own. The evidence doesn't demand this conclusion, but it certainly allows for it. And if there's even a possibility it's true, shouldn't we be investigating further instead of dismissing it out of hand? But here's what matters more than whether the Anunnaki were literally real. The framework they represent helps us see our current reality more clearly. Whether ancient aliens created us or not, we are living in systems of control. We do spend our lives laboring to enrich others. We are kept in states of fear and division. Our potential is suppressed. Our consciousness is limited. The specifics of who established these systems and when matter less than recognizing that they exist and that we have the power to change them. Knowledge is the first step to freedom. Understanding that you're in a prison is necessary before you can escape it. The ancient tablets, regardless of their literal truth, provide a lens for examining power structures, control systems, and the ways human potential has been systematically limited throughout history. They challenge us to question authority, to distrust official narratives, and to consider that reality might be far stranger and more complex than we've been taught. The Sumerian tablets are still being translated. Thousands remain untouched in museum storage. What other revelations are hidden in clay, waiting for someone brave enough to read them and share what they say? More importantly, why has there been so little urgency to translate and publish these texts? Why do certain tablets disappear from inventories? Why do academics who investigate these matters face career consequences? What are they afraid we might discover? Maybe the biggest question isn't what the tablets say about our past. Maybe it's what they reveal about our present and our potential future. If we were created limited, can we transcend those limitations? If we were designed to serve, can we reclaim sovereignty? If we've been trapped in cycles of control for millennia, can this be the generation that finally breaks free? The tablets describe humanity as a created species, but they also preserve something the creators might not have anticipated: the knowledge of our own origins, the recognition that we are more than we appear to be, the dangerous idea that prisoners who understand their chains are already halfway to freedom. The uncomfortable truth isn't just that we might be inmates in a planetary prison. It's that we're inmates who are starting to remember why the doors are locked and who holds the keys. And that changes everything. Thanks for staying with me through this entire journey. If this information resonated with you, if it sparked questions you need to explore further, then do your own research. Read the tablets, examine the evidence, question everything, including what I've presented here, because the search for truth is how we break free from whatever systems seek to control us. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember that the biggest lies are often the ones everyone agrees not to examine too closely.